Hello and welcome to our December webinar for Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. I'm Father George Williams. I'm the board chair of CPMC. And today our topic for discussion is prison ministry as truth-telling. And our speakers are, we have two speakers today. One is Dr. Elizabeth Phillips. She's joining us from England today. She's the Director of Education and Engagement at the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. She was formerly lecturer in Christian ethics at Westcott House, and she's taught Christian moral and political theologies, interfaith relations, and conflict transformation for over a decade in the Cambridge Theological Federation. She's also the author of many articles and books on political theology and Christian ethics. From 2016 to 2019, she co-designed, delivered, and researched a course inside a high security prison on the good life and the good society. And then from 2019 to 2020, she led the Flourishing Inside research project, which led to the publication of the co-edited volume, Catholic Social Thought in Prison Ministry, Resourcing Theory and Practice. And we also have with us Dr. Catherine Geddick-Solis, a fellow BC grad, and she's the director of the Center for Peace and Justice Education and associate teaching professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. Her research areas include mass incarceration, Catholic social thought, and family ethics. Catherine previously served as a Catholic prison chaplain in Boston and currently volunteers as a lay minister in the Philadelphia Department of Prisons. She's also one of the founding members of the Synodality in Catholic Higher Education in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, known as SHEEP. And Catherine and her husband are raising 3 children and a cat in Haverton, Pennsylvania. Welcome both of you, and thank you for being with us today and sharing your wisdom and experience. For those of you who are joining us live, as we go on today, if you have questions or comments, please write them in the chat feature, and then I will relay them to our panelists. So welcome both of you, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. So I'll begin today, and then I'll be handing over to Catherine in just a moment. So I want to introduce this idea of prison ministry as truth-telling. And Catherine's going to be changing the slides for me. So if you'll forgive the next slide, please, indications as we go. Let's go ahead and have the next slide. As was mentioned in the introduction, what I'm going to be talking about today arises from the Flourishing Inside study that was done with the Margaret Beaufort Institute, and also has to do with a book that arose from that project that you see there on the right. So the QR code will take you to the research project page and the actual report that came from the research project if you're interested in that. And then there's also the book that arose from the project. And as I was reading for the project, I became familiar with Catherine's work, and then I was very pleased that she accepted an invitation to contribute to the book that became part of the project. Next slide, please. So in the Flourishing Inside project, I sort of looked at 3 different areas, looked at literature having to do with theology and prisons, and with chaplaincy and prison chaplaincy in particular. So it was a wide literature review. Looked at Catholic social thought in terms of the overarching themes of Catholic social thought, and then as well as what work had been done within Catholic social teaching and wider Catholic social thought about prisons in particular. And then we also spoke with a group of participants, people who've done prison ministry, as well as people who were formerly in prisons. And so it came up with a series of findings that were sort of the intersections of these. And I won't be going through those today, but those are things you can look at either on the website or in the book if you're interested. But that's the research that this arises from. And if we take a look at the next slide, one of the things that arose from the project, again, that's on the website, and in the book as well, is this graphic, which I offered as a way of sort of showing the themes of Catholic social teaching and Catholic social thought in a way that recognizes this isn't just sort of a list. It really is an interdependent web of ideas and principles. And on the website, you can sort of roll over each of these and click and see a paragraph from Catholic social teaching or writing about Catholic social teaching that explains each of these themes. But what I'm going to focus on today is the idea of the prison chaplain as truth teller. And we'll see on the next slide that where I'm taking this from was a presentation that Rowan Williams made many years ago when he was a bishop in Wales before becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was speaking to a group of prison chaplains. And one of the things that he said was, we tend to take it for granted that chaplaincy is by its very nature a ministry whose emphasis will be on support or nurture. If people use the distinction between pastoral and prophetic ministry, they'll be inclined to put chaplaincy on the non-prophetic side. In such a context, I think the easy distinction between ministry that is unquestioningly supportive and one that is prophetically transforming does not actually make a great deal of sense. If we can go to the next slide, we'll see that what he goes on to unpack in that presentation that he made is the idea that the role of the prison chaplain is to be a remembrancer or a truth teller. And he says that the dimensions of this are speaking truth to people in prisons about who they are, that they are human persons with a past and a future, and that they are not just reducible to a crime. But it's also speaking truth to the prisons, and that involves critical analysis of power and a prophetic presence within that institution. And it also involves speaking truth about prisons and about the people in them. And that aims at changing the narratives in public opinion and in policymaking. So I'm going to unpack each of these just a little bit. So the next slide, we see speaking truth to people in prison. And I'm going to say a bit about each of these and what we found in the research related to them from those three areas of study that you saw on the first slide. So in Catholic social thought and wider theological literature, there's a very strong emphasis on the intrinsic worth and dignity of every human person. And we can also see that in empirical studies of prison chaplaincy, there seems to be good evidence that this is being put into practice by people who work in prison chaplaincy and prison pastoral care. That people in prison feel their personhood is recognized by chaplains, and that chaplaincy is humanizing in a place that can otherwise feel very dehumanizing. In the Flourishing Inside study, participants demonstrated that valuing people in prisons as fellow human beings and bearers of the image of God are central to chaplains' own understanding of their work. And they were also demonstrated in the experiences of former prison residents and how they experienced chaplaincies when they were inside prison. So in terms of speaking truth to people in prison, so far so good. On the next slide, we'll see a particularly compelling quote from one of our participants about this, who said, "We hope that we represent the image of Christ to people, but we also encounter Christ in them. So that transaction is what's central to what motivates me. The more I recognize Christ within the other, I realize how much it's lacking in me." So we see there a really profound sense of someone working in prison chaplaincy, not only that the people they're working with are their fellow human beings, but they're bearers of Christ to them. If we move to the next slide, we then move to the idea of speaking truth to prisons. And what we found here differs a little bit from what we found in relation to speaking truth to people in prison. So speaking truth to prisons has to do with connecting that pastoral duty of recognizing each individual's human dignity with the structural duties of testing the institution and its policies by that same measure of human dignity. So recognizing and analyzing and speaking out about things such as inequity, abuse of power, control, racism, victimization of the vulnerable, dehumanization, and threats to human rights. And in the theological literature that I reviewed, as well as the training materials for prison chaplaincy, and this was a study based in England and Wales, so that's where the training materials came from. I found that there was very little sustained attention to this aspect of the role or instruction for how to practice a critical or prophetic role. So in the places where it was mentioned and attention was paid to it, it would usually be saying, there's this aspect of the role, it's really important, and then no further reflection on what that actually looks like or any tools for equipping people to do that. So for instance, in a document the Church of England published in 1999, they said prison chaplains have dual accountability to the church and to the state, an obligation not only to work within the system, but also and always to examine that system and where necessary to challenge and work to change it. So there were many sort of passing comments like that, but not a lot of unpacking and certainly not a lot of equipping for that task. So on the next slide, we'll see a quote from one of our participants related to that. If we can have the next, there we go. So one participant who was relatively new to working in prison said, "It has such a Kafkaesque feeling about it as soon as you walk through the door." Now, my worry is, and this is not a criticism, that if you get to working in that system for long, do you not just begin to adjust to it? And the Kafkaesque nature of it just, and at this point, another participant finished that person's sentence and said, becomes normal. And this was something that they reflected on together about how what is self-evidently not normal upon arrival begins to be normalized in the experience of being inside the institution. So there seemed to be more of a disconnect between the theological literature and the intentions and what people were actually experiencing in their practice in terms of speaking truth to prisons. And then finally, we have speaking truth about prisons. So this gets us more towards joining the recognition of the personhood and dignity of every individual in prison with that task of critically analyzing the realities of the prison system. So the two things that we've already talked about, and then speaking both of these truths out into wider society. So this is the idea that prison chaplains have the role not only of being that truth teller to the people that they work with pastorally, being that truth teller prophetically to the institutions in which they work, but also then taking all of the knowledge and expertise that comes from that and speaking that truth out in society to impact opinions and ideally policies. Now, that probably all seems like a lot because it is. And in one of the pieces in the literature review, an author said who has worked in prison said, "Many of us will probably say that this is all very interesting, but that is really out of our reach. We are only prison chaplains. But we have expertise as prison chaplains, which we should share with society to look for better models of achieving justice in our societies." So I think these are the main concepts that I wanted to share with you today about these sort of three dimensions of the task and how that requires holding together the pastoral element of the role with a prophetic element of the role, and actually not seeing those as two different things, but that the pastoral and the prophetic are integrally related to one another. That it's difficult to pastorally recognize the human dignity of a person if then the ways in which their human dignity may not be recognized or honored by the institution where they're located, if that goes unquestioned or ignored, is that pastoral responsibility actually being fulfilled if that prophetic responsibility is not being fulfilled? And what we found in the study was that there was a real connection between what was shown as the theological ideal in the theological literature, what was reflected on in empirical studies of what actually happens, and what was reflected on by participants as their own experience. That all seemed to connect together really nicely. And then when we get to the prophetic roles of speaking truth to prisons and speaking truth about prisons, there was much more of a disconnect between people's understandings of the role and people's experiences of the role. And for example, um, when we asked people in prisons, people who had worked in prison ministry, about what made their roles difficult and challenging, most of the answers had to do with structural problems, and very often problems of structural injustice. But then when asked what sorts of resources would you like or do you need to help you do your job better, the answers were about liturgical and prayer and those kinds of resources. So there seemed to be, yeah, thank you for that next slide. So the study participants demonstrated an apparent disconnect between that pastoral role and that prophetic role, and asked what's most important and impactful about your work. They talked about religious provision. When asked what limits and frustrates you, they talked about systemic structural issues and issues of injustice. And then asked how could they better be trained, what resources would be helpful. Their answers related to doctrinal, spiritual, and liturgical resources. Now, Catherine, I'm afraid that what I have in front of me now does not have, if there's a next slide. Is there a further slide after this? Is that the last
Let
one?
me check. That may
Okay.
so let's see. Oh, yeah.
That's what I thought, that was the last one. Okay. So that's perfect, because we've come to the moment where I think it will be good to hand over to Catherine. Because she can unpack from her work a bit more about relating some of the specifics of Catholic social thought and Catholic social teaching to the prison context, and digging more into the idea of justice and injustice as it relates to prison ministry. So I'll hand over now to Catherine.
All right. Thank you so much, Beth. Really set this up beautifully, and I was so grateful to be a part of the book project. I just think was really wonderfully conceived. So thank you for all your good work. It's an honor to be here with you and to be back with the CPMC. So I'm continuing this theme for our presentation today on prison ministry's truth-telling, and I just want to, in my remarks, share a few words about how our Catholic social tradition can equip us as prison ministers to really lean into the prophetic nature of our ministry. I'll share a couple little examples, but I want to specifically talk about how prison ministers can tell a different story about humanity in terms of equality, dignity, interdependence, but then especially how we can tell a different story about justice. And ultimately, what I want to argue is that to be truth tellers, prison ministers have to be able to recognize and explain their ministry as a work of justice. So let me just begin with a quick reference here to Ash Wednesday. It was one of my favorite days to do work inside when I was at Chaplain in Boston, and I would be walking around the units and making marks on the foreheads of the men and the women too who are incarcerated there, and also invited to make marks on the foreheads of those who were employed to be incarcerating them. And so in a place where there are visuals all around to try to separate those two groups of people who are incarcerated and then people who are employed there to maintain that incarceration, there's lots of things that keep those visually separate, physically separate. This was a day where there was this visual sign of inequality across those lines. All human beings, all children of God, all in need of repentance. And that's something that felt like it was a moment of resistance to the us and them story that we often get both inside and outside, right? And there's the story that we hear that there's those on the inside, them in there are dangerous, they're liabilities, they're enemies, and that we on the outside can be made safer by their separation from us, right? And so this story of real separation, I think, is frankly challenged by the gospel and by our Catholic tradition. And as prison ministers, then we're asked to resist that and tell a different story about dignity, about equality, and really also about interdependence. We're all broken, we're all redeemable. And so this language that we have when we think about human dignity, it does more too. It's not just about the status here, but it's talking about our connections. And so the sense of that the social nature of the human being and that being critical to understanding human dignity. We have concepts in the tradition about participation, that it is necessary to realize our own flourishing, to be able to participate, to have a voice, to contribute, and that those contributions are actually necessary for the flourishing of the whole. We have the concept of solidarity, thinking about that we are all responsible for all, that we can't truly flourish and realize our fullness of what we are called to be without one another. And that it is critical for the common good that we don't lose one another. And so a colleague of mine, Megan Clark, a theologian, she's observed that actually the most radical claim of the Catholic social tradition is not that we are equal in humanity and dignity. I mean, we are, and that can be radical sometimes. But even beyond this idea of being equal in humanity and dignity, she says, beyond this is this idea that my humanity is bound up in yours. And so as a result, there's no us that is better off without them. And that's a story that I think we as folks connected here to the ministry really have to make sure that we uphold that and challenge it when we encounter it. And so, for me, I feel like for those going in behind bars, it is ultimately not because we have something different to offer, right? But it's actually because we are fundamentally the same as the individuals we encounter inside, whether incarcerated or employed, right? That the point is that we go in because we all wear ashes on Ash Wednesday. And so there's one day a year that we can see that visually. I think the prison minister's task, one of them, a significant one, is that the 364 other days of the year, we have to figure out a way to make that visible. That to resist the ways we demonize others and to proclaim prophetically that there are in fact no enemies among us. Even in the realities of grave harm, there are no enemies among us. And so one of the ways that this can be really hard to speak to on the outside, especially. And so one of the strategies that I found really helpful is to make sure to zoom out from individuals who are incarcerated and see the people that they are connected to. My humanity is bound up in yours, right? This web of relationality is really actually important for how we talk about things. And so what I will often try to invite into the imaginative space, the family, especially children connected to people who are incarcerated, because it helps us to remember that there is no sort of, there are no absolutes here. And as a practitioner in some literature I was looking at once said that there may be parents who deserve to lose access to their children, but they've never met a child who deserves to lose access to their parent. And so thinking about how can we communicate this, how can we share this, I think keeping those relationships in mind is really important. And it connects in some way to the next thing I want to talk about, which is that prison ministers really can tell a different story about justice. And our Catholic tradition has a way of talking about justice that is a little bit different than what we typically think of. And when people refer to justice, a lot of times we think that we're all talking about the same thing, and we're usually not. So one of the most recognizable ways we talk about justice is through the key of retribution. And this picture of the scales is very familiar to us all. It's kind of the only reliable image that you can get if you want to image justice. And so a retributive approach makes some sense, it has some value, but I'm saying here is ultimately inadequate for the fullness of justice that we talk about in the Catholic tradition. And, retributive justice is focused on transactional relations, right? What do people owe? Debts must be paid. It exists as an enforcing power that ensures that individuals are getting what is due. And so when you're focused on making sure people get what's due, if you get less than what's due, forgiveness, mercy, then that runs right up against justice. So in this mindset, justice and mercy are mutually exclusive options. You have one or the other, they are opposed. And that is a very familiar and accessible kind of thought about justice. And it's not enough. And so the way I wanted to share that with us, the tradition has some really beautiful ways of talking about it, but actually it's in a papal audience of Pope Francis that he really distills this quite well. And so I want to share some of that with you here. So he says, if we think of the legal administration of justice, we see that it is retributive justice, which inflicts a penalty on the guilty party, according to the principle that each person must be given his or her due. This path, however, does not lead to true justice, because in reality, it does not conquer evil. It merely checks it. Only by responding to it with good can evil be truly overcome. And he goes on, only in this way can justice triumph, because thus, if the culprit acknowledges the evil done and ceases to do it, the evil is no more. And he who was unjust becomes just, because he is forgiven and is helped to rediscover the path of goodness. And this is where forgiveness and mercy come in. So it's significant here, right, that justice is not about making a situation just, it's about making a person just. He goes on, this is how God acts towards us sinners. The Lord continually offers us his pardon and helps us to accept it and to be aware of our wrongdoing, so as to free us of it. For God wants not our condemnation, but our salvation. And finally, God is, I'm sorry, the Father who does justice with his mercy. Doing justice with mercy, that those are not opposed. They're not mutually exclusive. So what this is painting a picture of is really different from what we just saw. And it's this idea of what does true justice look like? Well, it's relational. It's about being in right relationship with God and with others. It's social. And this idea is that not that it's this enforcing power, but a saving, intervening power, particularly on behalf of the vulnerable. In fact, in Scripture, the words in Scripture that are related to justice really aren't about punishing people well. They're about intervening on behalf of those in need. right? That's the justice. That's why we are asking for justice. And so finally, this idea, justice and mercy here are in harmony. They work in the same direction. And so when you put these two ways of talking about justice up against one another, you see that there's some really significant differences here. And we need to know what one another is talking about, because it has pretty real implications. And I recognize that still this language of justice is owing is very attractive, and for good reason. But what I want to suggest is that we can think about true justice in this way of owing, but what we owe to one another is our humanity, the way that it ought to be, the right relationships as they were intended, right? So this is why we talk about justice as restorative, because you're taking action. Justice is about taking action to restore relations as they ought to be. That's what we owe one another, to try to make these relationships exist in the way that God had intended all along. Okay, and I think that is an idea captured pretty well in this quote that's included in the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. It's of St. Gregory the Great. It says, when we attend to the needs of those in want, we give them what is theirs, not ours. More than performing works of mercy, we are paying a debt of justice. This idea that people are owed what they need to survive and to flourish. So when we make sure that happens, we shouldn't be congratulated for our kindness. We're giving to them what is due to them in God's world. And so it's an act of justice that we're doing by making sure that those needs are met, not just some optional kindness that we should pat ourselves on the back for. It can also be hard to talk about theories of justice, and it can get a little deep. And so there's some shorthand, I think, for getting to these ideas that can be really helpful. And that is particularly around the contrast of punishment and accountability. And Danielle Sered really talks about this beautifully, and I want to share a quote. She's the executive director of Common Justice, who does a lot of work in restorative justice, particularly around very violent offenses. And she says this: for all the faults of prison, the dehumanization, the prevalence of violence, the human and financial cost, the impracticality, the collateral consequences, the impact on families and other loved ones, it has another flaw that is rarely talked about. Prison is a poor vehicle for accountability. This may sound strange in a country that has equated punishment and accountability, but the two are not the same. And indeed, they're not. Punishment is passive. Punishment, it just asks that people endure what they are subjected to. Not much else. Accountability requires action and agency. And so Sered talks about a number of elements of accountability. I think this language is really familiar to folks talking about restorative justice, right? It requires recognizing the impact of harm, acknowledging responsibility, expressing remorse, taking active steps to repair, becoming the sort of person who will act differently going forward. And this is real work. This requires humility, commitment. It requires a lot of support. That's significant effort that requires activity and agency. This is what we want. This is what true justice requires. Punishment doesn't get us very far. And so when we might speak critically, right, when we're speaking truth to prisons, about prisons, it may feel like it may be difficult to do that, but in a certain way, what we're saying is that we don't want to give anyone a pass for harm, but we're saying that punishment sets the bar too low. It doesn't actually do what you need to do. And that wanting to move to a justice that looks very different from a system that we have is actually putting the bar higher about accountability and taking harm seriously. But it requires that the work is a lot harder and the work is a lot more human. So I recognize that this, and Beth, spoke to this as well, right? this is a real balancing act, to try to speak to these issues when you are also trying to maintain access to these highly guarded spaces. And so you have the need to maintain access to fulfill pastoral responsibilities on one hand, and then you also have a mandate of our faith not to be complicit in systems that regularly dehumanize and cause injustice. So how do you do that? And it is not easy. But the fact is that as prison ministers, we're the ones who get to see what very few others get to see. And we're the ones who get to hear stories that very few other people get to hear. And so we have a responsibility as we can to really share out and to speak to and tell the truth about what this place is and what the people are who are there. And so I really think that it's in the prison minister's words, action, and sometimes it's just even the very presence, the physical presence that can be a source of resistance. And these are the things that we need to take stock of to figure out how we can tell the truth. And it looks different in different situations. Sometimes it can't be the words, but it's just going to be the way that we conduct ourselves and the spaces that we're going to be committed to showing up in. But it has to be a resistance to this narrative of us and them, right? 365 days of the year. It has to carve out space for incarcerated persons to experience their equality, their agency, their responsibility, their belonging. It has to be about really speaking about prison ministry, not as some nice, generous gesture, but as, a work of justice, out of our responsibility to others. I've felt, after I stumbled into the work of prisons, prison ministry, I've felt a certain call to be present to those realities. As long as prisons are around, I need to be present to those realities, both on the inside and on the outside. And to do that, I think means that we have to make our ministry visible beyond those walls, and make it clear to folks on the outside how important this is. And I included this picture here because when I was chaplain up in Boston, I was one year buying some artificial Easter lilies to be able to decorate the chapel with, and ahead of our Easter celebration. And so I was checking out, the woman at the register said, "Oh, those are such beautiful flowers." And I said, "Oh, thank you. I'm going to be bringing them into the prison there for our Easter services." And then her demeanor changed, and she said, "Oh, they don't deserve such beautiful things." And so what do you say? What do you say in a situation like that? Because, I get it, right? Maybe she's thinking about all the things she's heard and seen about people who are incarcerated. Maybe she's thinking about someone who has deeply harmed her, or someone that she loves and who is currently incarcerated. Who knows? We don't know her story. We don't know what she's bringing into that space. But I can't be faithful to the folks that I have a pastoral responsibility on the inside if I just walk away either. And so what do you say? We all know I see that. It can be really hard. But Easter reminds us that there's a lot of things that we don't deserve, but we get forgiven for anyway. And seems like that's what God is about for me. Forgiving for things that we don't maybe deserve to be forgiven for. And so that's what I have to bring in. That's what I want to bring in. It's hard. I think the other thing that I wanted to just close with is to say, in addition to making our ministry visible and what it's about visible, even in these small, unexpected interactions, is just being really attentive to the language and even challenging others to be attentive to their language, to be vigilant about it. This idea of people first language, right? People who are incarcerated, people who are formerly incarcerated, people who have been convicted, rather than inmates, prisoners, felons, criminals, dehumanizing language. We have to, the call to people first language is really, significant. The other thing about language is I am uncomfortable using the language of a correctional institution or criminal justice. Sometimes I use it because of the different contexts I'm in, but in fact, I would much prefer to say criminal legal system, because I don't really think they're doing justice. I don't think they're doing correction. And I think the meaning of words needs to be honored. And so I want to use my language carefully, and I want to ask other people about what they mean when they use their words, and what do they mean when they use the concept of justice. And be curious and be humble about it, and know that there's a lot of pain here. But there's also a lot of hope for how we move forward. And so I just want to close by saying, I think language matters. I think presence matters. I think how we talk about justice matters. And I think as prison ministers, we have to take all that into account if we're going to tell the truth about the good news, and if we're going to embrace the prophetic call of our Catholic tradition. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. A couple of questions are in the queue here, but I want to start maybe picking up on the image you had of the flowers for the prison in Boston. And this is probably more speaking from an American context, although I'd be interested to know how it plays out in England. How do we begin to engage the public in a critical examination of our carceral system, when the reality here in North America is that the dominant culture renders prisons invisible? It's pretty much sort of a byproduct of structural racism. Those of us who were raised in the dominant culture here were socialized not to see prisons, not to think about them, because it wouldn't apply to us. And so it's hard to kind of begin the conversation about something that is really invisible to many people in our culture. Any thoughts about how we can address that?
Yeah, well, I have an easy answer for me that doesn't refer. I mean, so I get to also teach. And so one of the things that is a priority for it's a priority from things I write, but it's also a priority for the things I teach. And my goal is to make those walls as porous as I can. And so I actually have been able to get on-campus students into different facilities, and because honestly, I teach a lot of these themes in my class, but they it doesn't really land until they get in. And there's something very experiential about this, which is, I think, the challenge, which you're speaking to correctly. But I mean, I also just have to acknowledge that I need to get people in. I also have guest speakers come in, a number of folks who I know who are formerly incarcerated, who are doing activism in the area, and they can really speak to their experiences. I mean, ultimately, it's about encounter. It's about human encounter, which follows Pope Francis and our tradition very well. And the idea of it being relational, that to really help people see this is that you have to help people encounter people. And so ideally, I like to bring people in, but otherwise there's lots of ways to make those encounters possible. But we have to meet one another and hear each other's stories. So we have to find ways to create more spaces to tell those stories, and to invite people to think that they need to hear them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about you, Beth, from your perspective in England, what would you say?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. In the course that I taught in prison, it was part of a program where we took Cambridge students into prison, and then we would teach a course where the Cambridge students and the prison-based students were just all students together, on equal footing, as much as there can be such a thing as equal footing when there's so much inequality. Some of the most profound transformations and learning were in those students' experience, the Cambridge students' experience, rather than the prison-based students' experience. Although they had good experiences as well. But I remember one of the students afterwards saying, I realized, and I can't believe I never understood, like, what a huge part of society the prison system is, and how we think and talk so regularly about huge parts of society, like the educational system and the healthcare system, and that the prison system is like that, and yet we don't. It's invisible to us. And they went away really energized to do something about that. I think what I would add as well is the importance of volunteers. That was something that really came out of the research as well, that from all different angles, from empirical evidence, from literature about chaplaincy, from the experience of people who've been in prisons, encountering volunteers, and then what those volunteers then can take out into society in terms of understanding and changing opinions and changing the narrative. And then also people helping people in the transition out of prison, and churches welcoming people and making connections possible, and forms of chaplaincy that help with that transition. And of course there's lots of complex safeguarding requirements that go along with that, but that's another way to help change the narrative, is to actually encounter people who are leaving prison as fellow human beings and helping them make a way in society where everything is stacked against them.
And perhaps maybe on a more of a practical way of addressing structural change. One of our viewers today poses this question. We don't really have, as pastors in the prison environment, a private kind of protected communication. So he asks, why can't we expand the prison ministries to include a legal arm? And for example, there's something called Kingdom Litigators International. Any thoughts about how, in terms of advocacy, we can be able to function outside the institution, while in a sense we are inside, and while we're inside, we are complicit with the system because we have to be in order to get in the door. So maybe address that tension between advocacy and complicity.
Well, I mean, and just in terms of the advocacy piece, I've found it really helpful to join with a number of different, like, especially local nonprofits, especially ones that are being led by folks who have experienced incarceration themselves, and have been taking the lead from them. But the capacity in which I can assist them, and then also make sure I don't create a barrier for me to keep going inside. I always have to be careful with like what kind of specific examples that I could contribute, to anything. But I just think that the folks are doing really good work, and you just have to find them and become partners and figure out where you're, I don't know, where the space is. But I mean, I don't know, you're asking too about this question of the balancing. I just find it's a very it's a very active discernment, right? I find that there's not a really good formulaic answer. But I think you have to acknowledge that it requires a lot of energy to discern on a daily basis what am I going to speak up about, what am I not going to speak up about, because with the understanding that there is a good here that I'm trying to preserve, which is my pastoral relationship, and making sure that folks have someone to come in and represent this, and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I can think of examples of different decisions I've made at different times of how to manage that, but I don't know that I have been able to articulate a guiding principle on the higher scale. I don't know, Beth, what are your thoughts here?
I mean, you're much closer to that experience than I am, but I mean, I guess I would just highlight what you've already said about it. The tightrope was a very apt image. I don't think there's ever a moment where anyone's ever going to feel they've resolved this in their ministry and they've worked it out and now they know how to hold that tension. It's always going to be a real active determination to hold that tension. And I guess it did occur to me while you were talking that one piece can be also some really good pastoral supervision that's outside the prison system for people who work inside the prison system, that there's someone that they can confidentially talk through that with, who understands the role and can help them in that discernment process, in a space that's outside of the prison context.
Nice. Yeah.
One of our listeners today is writing that we also may have opportunities to remain in contact, maybe not personally, but with residents after they leave the prison system, that would further validate their dignity as human beings, and looking for ways to network in a way that offers opportunities for assisting people after they leave prison is really important for us to consider, not just while they're in prison, but what happens when they get out.
Yeah. And that becomes a real test of whether what we're doing on the inside is genuine, right? Because if our concern and our prioritization stops because someone's not physically behind the same bars anymore, and then it didn't really mean anything to begin with, right? Then it was just situational. So if it's really about the human beings that we are encountering and have the privilege of encountering, then that's not something that should end. Now it may have to change depending on what, there are, again, some provisions that one might have to work within. But I mean, at the very least, they should be no less present in our prayer than they were when they were on the inside, when they're on the out, right? And if they are, then there's something that's changed that we need to examine that. But I think trying to figure out, even if we can't be a part of it, how can we connect people to communities that we know will continue to care for them? If it's real, then it spans everyone's lifetime and circumstances. And so, that was a real grief for me actually in Boston, is, and here too in Philly, actually, just thinking about a conversation this past Sunday, but, folks who are like, well, where do I go? And when I don't have all the answers that I would love to be able to offer about where you go, where these communities are that I can I can rely on to welcome you. That's something that we have to attend to. And there's a large folk in CPMC who are thinking about the full range of places of encounter.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that CPMC were trying to stress is that when we're talking about prison and detention ministry, we're not just talking about going into the prison. Oftentimes, there are ways of doing this ministry for people who have served time and are now out, or serving their families, or serving victims of crime, or the staff. I mean, there's many different ways of approaching this. And the respect the boundaries where, say, I myself at St. Quentin, I can't go out and hang around with guys after they get out of prison. That would be kind of a violation of my boundary as a chaplain there. But there are people who can do that, and I can connect them. And so that's what we're trying to do, is create that awareness that when we're talking about prison ministry, we're talking about something much more, it's much larger than simply walking into the prisons themselves. I think a good place to end would be with a comment that Rich writes here. He wrote, I personally find it effective when speaking with people is to acknowledge that the prisoners are there for a particular reason, and we don't dispute that, or can we affect that from our position, but that's only half the equation. We must also be reformative and thus transformative. That's where the beauty of the flowers are important. And the continual expression of God's love through each of us, and that it is unceasing even as each of us deals with our daily setbacks. As for the language, I think we're in danger of covering the situation as a denial of what the reality is. It's a very big issue, but I think that's well put. Another person writes, Charlotte writes, what's really helped me figure out the balancing act has been the ability to see how much of our prison ministry is about how much it can really help the correctional officers, as well as the prisoners themselves. And that's a really good point. I agree with that wholeheartedly. One of the ways we can help change the environment of the prisons is we don't change the prisoners, we help change the culture of the correction officers. And that's what we're actually doing here in California with the California model, and seeing some exciting movement in that direction. It's going to be a long time, but it's possible and it's doable. And if you missed our program in November, we featured a discussion on ways of imagining changing the prison system. And you can find that, it was November 14th, you can find that on our website, the recording of it. It was comparing a program in Brazil that's where they have basically a prison with no guards and no locks on the doors. And we also compare that with the California model we have here in California. So it was a very interesting conversation. So it would be another way of kind of pursuing what our viewers are saying. Now we're running up to the end of our time. So do you have any final comments, either Beth or Catherine, before we finish?
I think on the point about helping people when they've left prison, in this country, there are community chaplaincies which exist for this reason, but there's no joined up system for making sure that everybody gets signposted to a community chaplaincy. And so there was a really poignant interview I did with someone who said, they'd been in prison 4 times, and each time they would just come out to a sense of complete hopelessness and inability to connect to any way of finding people, getting employment, finding a different way to live, and would just end up right back in prison. And it wasn't until the prison chaplain connected them to a community chaplain that they could follow up with on the outside, that cycle was finally broken. So it is incredibly important.
We should follow up with discussion of these community chaplains. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
And how about you, Catherine?
No, I mean, I'm appreciative of this space, and I think even the comments here are just what other folks have found to be helpful for how they articulate what they're doing, how they discern the balancing act. I think this really gets to the vision of what started CPMC, was that the need for spaces for folks to figure out how one another do this and manage this. Just like Beth's point about the supervision, I think just in addition, this opportunity to have peers as we walk the path together to figure it out. So I think that's really speaks to a real need, and a way that it just helps enrich both the ministers and then all the folks who are going to be impacted by the minister's work, to have spaces like this in CPMC and others to create those points of contact and idea sharing.
Well, thank you both for your sharing today, and appreciate you joining us all the way from England, Dr. Phillips.
Thank you.
Learn about what you're doing there. And also, Catherine, it's always wonderful to kind of be reminded of our work together at Suffolk County House of Correction. Brings back a lot of good memories in Boston. So thanks again for joining us, and blessed holidays to all of you as we continue entering into the time of Advent. May this be a blessed time for you and your loved ones. Thank you again, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Geddes. Good to see you.